Hello, my name is Janae Wilson, and I'll be covering the topic of overrepresentation of English language learners in special education. So, English language learners are the fastest growing population in public schools today. With their unique needs, it's become evident that more and more English language learners are being misidentified as students with special needs due to the additional supports required for academic achievement. There are some issues that inherently contribute to the overrepresentation of ELL students in special education, and so the purpose of this presentation is to explore some of those reasons. So we will look at the effects of inappropriate assessment procedures and interventions that have contributed to this overrepresentation and misidentification issue of English language learning students. Methods. So I had four criteria. It had to be an original research study. It had to include some commonalities among students with special educations, preferably specific learning disability and English language learners. Include some patterns in misidentification among special education population and some data on inclusion and intervention strategies most successful for English language learners. I chose keywords from my research question, and the two databases that I used were ERIC and PsycInfo, and here's a list of some of the keywords that I used right here. The search strategies that I focused on were two Boolean operators and an OR, as we know, and the AND operator narrows the search while OR broadens the search. And here's just a chart of some of the results that I got with the pairings of my keywords, the Boolean operator, and the number of results I got on ERIC and PsycInfo, as you can see, and definitely narrowed the search while OR broadened it a bit too much for my liking. So I more so use the AND operator than the OR. The process of elimination is when the articles were placed into an Excel spreadsheet where I could compare the information and decide if it met the criteria, or at least one or two of my criteria, and was conducive to my research so that I could include it in my literature review. On to results of the assessments and interventions. So for assessments, some of the problems that were mentioned were that the traditional methods used in public schools, they fail to distinguish between students struggling to learn a second language and those who had a genuine cognitive disability. Also, norm reference and standardized test scores were biased toward English proficient examinees, and the lack of data in ELL students' primary language in English. So the solutions was a systemic model that involved reviewing multiple sources of information, not just standardized test scores, but their cumulative data over the years, like their student folders and things. Observing the student in their natural learning environment across multiple settings, not only the setting that's being referred for, like math and reading, but across all settings, even those extracurricular activities and electives, seeing how um, they're progressing in all of their settings in school. Developing a data-driven hypothesis, and this will assess in the selection of a proper battery of assessment and the evaluation of English language development scores to determine the most suitable language to assess in prior to the evaluation. Here's just a comparison of some behaviors associated with a learning disability versus English as a second language acquisition. Um, I felt that this was a very clear representation of why and how ELO students are being misidentified because the behaviors are very similar. The difference is the reasoning behind it. Um, as far as like following directions, remembering sight words, retelling a story, if there are gaps in the acquisition of English as a second language, it's going to be very difficult for English language learners to demonstrate proficiency in these areas. Interventions, some of the problems that were mentioned were that teachers need to continually evaluate the effectiveness of their current interventions, their need for professional development in working with ELL students, and teachers need to make appropriate accommodations to make learning context culturally, socially, and linguistically meaningful for ELL students. The solutions suggested were formative evaluations of ELL students in English and their first language, professional development geared toward educating ELL students, problem-solving teams to help teachers in decision making for ELL students, and objectives that include academic and social emotional development. On to discussion and limitations. So, as stated before, this model framework that systemically assesses ELL children in a non-discriminatory manner may help address this issue of overrepresentation of ELL students in special education. And just to review, it was multiple sources of information, observation of the students, data-driven hypothesis, English language development, and the language assessments that are given in their first and second language to help determine their language proficiency. These are all very crucial components to the evaluation process. And then interventions. So it was made very clear that teachers, both general and special education teachers, are just not adequately trained to work with students with diverse cultural backgrounds or children whose home language is not English. So, some of the remedies to this issue was collaboration was a number one solution mentioned, and with teachers and staff that have expertise in working with ELO students, and the professional development regarding language acquisition, along with some coaching um, on identification and assessment of individuals at risk for having a learning disability. All of this knowledge together can be taken and embedded throughout the classroom environment, instruction, interventions, and accommodations. So some limitations. Although this model approach is a valuable tool in reducing the biases in the evaluation process, still no single method has been proven effective in truly differentiating between ELLs who have difficulty acquiring language skills versus those who have a specific learning disability. So because of this, um, ELL students are misidentified and they end up in classrooms or programs mismatched to their needs, which could definitely hinder their academic achievement. And also, assessment models for assessment adopted by public schools normally just focus on one level of analysis: the individual student, the classroom, assessment and identification procedures. The articles have demonstrated that these levels of assessment need to be considered simultaneously. So, for future studies, they may look into comparing the difference between the effectiveness of looking at each level independently versus looking at them being used simultaneously to validate the need for a systemic model. Thank you so much for your time. I hope that this was helpful, and I look forward to hearing from you soon.